Imagine this. If there were a button in front of you that could erase all suffering from your life, every heartbreak, every loss, every moment of despair, would you press it? Most of us would be tempted to say yes. Who wouldn't want to live in a world of constant happiness, free from pain? Yet James Hillman, one of the most provocative depth psychologists of the 20th century, would tell you that pressing that button would rob you of something essential. To Hillman, suffering is not an accident, not a flaw in the human condition. It is the very soil in which the soul takes root and grows. To explore this idea, let's turn to myth. In Greek mythology, there is the story of Psyche, whose very name means soul. Psyche was a mortal woman of extraordinary beauty, so captivating that even the goddess Aphrodite grew jealous. When Psyche fell in love with Eros, the god of desire, Aphrodite devised a series of impossible trials to punish her. One of the most terrifying of these trials required Psyche to descend into the underworld and retrieve a box from Persephone, queen of the dead. Imagine the dread. The soul itself, walking into the land of shadows, surrounded by ghosts, despair, and silence. It is the darkest place a human being can imagine. And yet, it was only by going through this descent, by embracing suffering and death, that Psyche could ultimately be transformed and reunited with Eros. Hillman often returned to this myth because it represents something fundamental about the soul. He believed that our inner lives cannot be understood through progress, happiness, or positivity alone. Instead, the soul demands depth, and depth often appears in the form of suffering. When Psyche goes into the underworld, she doesn't go there to be destroyed. She goes there to be initiated, to discover a truth that cannot be learned in any other way. Now think about your own life. Have you ever experienced a moment so dark that you thought you would never emerge from it? Maybe it was the death of someone you loved. Maybe it was the loss of a relationship you thought would last forever. Maybe it was the collapse of a dream you had carried for years. At the time, it felt unbearable, as though the ground had disappeared from beneath your feet. And yet, looking back, those very moments of suffering shaped you in ways that joy never could. They deepened your perspective. They cracked open parts of your heart you didn't even know existed. Hillman argued that the modern world has lost this understanding. We live in a culture obsessed with fixing, healing, and moving on quickly. If we feel pain, we want medication. If we feel sadness, we want a quick solution, a distraction, a way to silence the discomfort. But what if, Hillman asks, the soul doesn't want to be cured of suffering? What if the soul actually needs to dwell there, to live in the shadow, in order to become fully itself? This is what makes Hillman's view so radical. He does not say that suffering is good in the sense of something we should actively seek out. Rather, he insists that suffering has meaning, that it belongs to the story of who we are. By trying to erase it, we erase ourselves. Look again at Psyche. Her suffering was not random. Each trial she endured forced her to confront a different aspect of her humanity: humility, patience, endurance, and courage. And the ultimate descent into Hades symbolized the greatest truth of all, that the soul is inseparable from death, loss, and impermanence. Without acknowledging these realities, the soul remains shallow, untested, and incomplete. So, here is the first lesson. Suffering is not an interruption of life. It is life. Just as seasons change, just as night follows day, suffering is woven into the fabric of existence. To deny it is to deny the very rhythm of the soul. Let me ask you, when was the last time you truly grew as a person? Was it in a period of ease and comfort, when everything went smoothly? Or was it in a time of heartbreak, when you were forced to question everything, when the old ways no longer worked, and you had no choice but to change? Hillman would say, those are the moments when the soul speaks loudest. Those are the moments when suffering, like Psyche's descent, becomes the initiation into a deeper, fuller way of being. And perhaps that is why the great myths never promise us a life without pain. Instead, they remind us that the path of the soul always includes darkness. But within that darkness lies the possibility of transformation, a rebirth that joy alone could never give. So, if you find yourself in a place of suffering right now, remember Psyche walking into the underworld. Remember that your descent may not be the end of your story, but the very beginning of your soul's deeper journey. In today's world, happiness has become a kind of religion. Open any social media app, and you will find endless images of smiling faces, motivational quotes, luxury vacations, and quick-fix life hacks. We are constantly told, be positive. Don't look back. Move on. Focus on the bright side. At first, this sounds harmless, even uplifting. But James Hillman saw something dangerous in this cultural obsession. He believed that by worshiping happiness, we were cutting ourselves off from the soul itself. Think about it. What happens when you feel sadness or despair in a culture that demands constant positivity? You begin to feel guilty, ashamed, as though you've failed. Instead of asking, what is this sorrow trying to tell me? You ask, how quickly can I get rid of it? You rush to distract yourself with entertainment, consume self-help books, or even numb the pain with medication. And in doing so, you miss the deeper meaning of your suffering. Hillman called this the problem of pathologizing happiness. He argued that we have turned happiness into an idol, and in doing so, we treat suffering as a mistake, as an illness to be cured. But for Hillman, suffering was not a disease, it was a teacher. By silencing it too quickly, we silence the soul's voice. Let's pause here and ask, have you ever noticed how some of your most meaningful memories are not purely happy ones? Maybe it was a breakup that taught you the true value of love. Maybe it was a failure that forced you to discover your hidden strength. These moments weren't cheerful, yet they left a mark deeper than any vacation photo or motivational slogan. Hillman would say, that mark is the work of the soul. To illustrate this, let's return again to mythology. Consider the figure of Hades, the god of the underworld. In our culture, Hades is often demonized as evil, the ruler of death and darkness. But in the ancient Greek imagination, Hades was not a villain. He was necessary. He guarded the realm where souls went after death, and without him, the cycle of life and rebirth could not exist. Hillman used this myth to remind us that darkness is not the enemy of life. It is the balance that gives life its depth. In other words, our modern attempt to avoid suffering is like trying to erase Hades from the story of existence. We want only the sunshine of Apollo, only the beauty of Aphrodite, only the light. But without Hades, without descent, without grief, the story of the soul collapses into shallow illusion. Consider, too, how the language of self-improvement has taken over our lives. We are told we must constantly upgrade ourselves, be more productive, more attractive, more successful. And yet, where in this endless cycle of improvement is there space for mourning, for melancholy, for simply sitting with the heaviness of life? Hillman would argue that by rejecting these states, we deny the very experiences that make us human. Let me ask you, do you feel pressure to always appear strong, cheerful, and successful, even when you are falling apart inside? What if, instead of hiding those feelings, you allowed yourself to listen to them? What if your sadness was not an obstacle, but a doorway into the depth of your soul? Hillman believed that suffering deepens our imagination. When we are wounded, we begin to dream differently, to create differently, to see the world in new ways. Think of the great works of art, literature, and music. How many of them were born out of pure happiness? Far more often, they arose from longing, grief, or conflict. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once said, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Hillman would have agreed, suffering is not just darkness, it is a disguised invitation. But here is the paradox. We cannot manufacture suffering for the sake of growth. Life will bring it to us on its own. What matters is not whether we suffer, but how we relate to that suffering when it arrives. Do we run from it, numb it, and bury it? Or do we turn toward it, allowing it to guide us into a deeper relationship with our soul? In this sense, Hillman saw therapy, philosophy, and even mythology not as tools to eliminate pain, but as companions in our journey through it. The goal is not to heal in the sense of erasing scars, but to live meaningfully with them. Scars, after all, tell a story. They remind us of where we've been, of battles fought and endured. Without them, our lives would be blank pages. So perhaps the real danger is not suffering itself, but the illusion of a painless life. A life polished and filtered for social media, where every smile is staged and every hardship is hidden. Such a life may look perfect from the outside, but inside, it is hollow. Hillman's message is simple yet radical. The soul does not want perfection. It wants depth, and depth requires shadows. Let me turn the question back to you. What is the one experience of suffering that has shaped you the most? And what if, instead of wishing it away, you honored it as a part of your soul's story? In our culture, happiness is sold as the ultimate goal. But Hillman whispers from the shadows, don't forget your suffering. That is where your soul is waiting for you. By now, we have followed James Hillman into the darker corners of the human psyche. We have seen how myths like Psyche's descent and the realm of Hades remind us that suffering is inseparable from the soul. But the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? If suffering is not an accident, if it is not something to be erased, then how are we meant to live with it? Hillman never offered a neat, three-step solution. In fact, he warned against turning suffering into yet another self-help project. Instead, he invited us to imagine suffering differently, not as a curse, but as a companion, a strange teacher that walks alongside us. Let's return once more to myth. Think of Chiron, the wounded healer. In Greek mythology, Chiron was a centaur who was struck by a poisoned arrow. Though immortal, his wound never healed. For eternity, he carried pain that could not be erased. And yet, out of this wound, Chiron became the wisest of teachers, a healer to gods and heroes alike. His suffering did not vanish. It became the ground of his wisdom. Hillman loved this story because it illustrates a truth about the human condition. Healing does not always mean erasing the wound. Sometimes it means discovering what can grow from it. Just as Chiron's wound became the source of his gift, our own suffering can become a wellspring of imagination, compassion, and depth. Think about the people you admire most. Are they the ones who have lived without hardship? Or are they the ones who have endured loss, heartbreak, or struggle and somehow transformed it into something meaningful? Perhaps they wrote a book, created art, cared for others, or simply developed a quiet strength. Their suffering did not destroy them. It carved them into who they are. Hillman would say, this is the work of the soul. The soul is not interested in a life without wounds. The soul is interested in what we do with those wounds. But how do we begin to live with suffering in this way? Hillman suggested 3 practices, not in the sense of rules, but as invitations. First, we must give suffering a language. Too often, we silence our pain. We bury it in busyness, drown it in distractions. But the soul thrives when suffering is spoken, when it is allowed to take form in words, images, or art. This is why people write poetry after heartbreak, why they paint in grief, why they dream vividly in crisis. Expression does not erase the pain, but it gives the soul a vessel through which the pain can breathe. Second, we must learn to dwell with suffering rather than rush through it. Our culture pushes us to get over it as quickly as possible, but Hillman insisted that depth takes time. Just as Psyche could not skip her trials, we cannot skip the nights of sorrow that shape us. To dwell with suffering is to allow ourselves to feel fully, to sit with grief, to honor sadness, to recognize that these states are not enemies but parts of our inner landscape. Third, we must look for the images that suffering brings. Hillman was, above all, an imaginal psychologist. He believed that every emotion, even despair, carries symbolic images that point to the soul's desires. For example, depression might bring the image of winter, a season of stillness, reflection, and waiting. Anxiety might bring the image of Hermes, the restless trickster who pushes us toward new paths. By exploring these images, we move from suffering as raw pain to suffering as a guide. So let me ask you, what images arise from your suffering? If your pain could speak, what story would it tell? Hillman believed that when we approach suffering this way, we move beyond the shallow promise of happiness and into something richer, meaning. Happiness may come and go like weather, but meaning roots itself deep in the soul. Meaning transforms wounds into wisdom, losses into compassion, and despair into creativity. This is not an easy path. It is not meant to be. But think of it as soul-making. Just as fire tempers metal, suffering tempers the soul. It burns away illusions, forcing us to face what truly matters. At the end of Psyche's myth, after all her trials, after her descent into the underworld, she is finally united with Eros. But she is no longer the same innocent girl who first fell in love. She has been transformed by her suffering into someone deeper, wiser, more whole. And perhaps that is the secret Hillman wanted us to understand. The soul is not made by avoiding suffering, but by walking through it, carrying its weight, and discovering the gift hidden inside it. So, if you are suffering now, know this: your pain is not meaningless. It is not a detour. It is part of your soul's unfolding. You do not need to rush to erase it. Instead, you can ask, what is this suffering teaching me? What image is it revealing? What part of my soul is it trying to awaken? In this light, suffering becomes less of an enemy and more of a companion, unwanted, yes, but essential. For without it, there is no depth. Without it, there is no story. Without it, the soul cannot be born. Hillman once wrote, "We must accept our suffering not as punishment, but as our lot, as our destiny, and thus as our possibility for soul." Perhaps that is the final gift, to recognize that our suffering, however heavy, is also the place where our soul waits to meet us.